Hello. Today I would like to talk about Philip K. Dick's 1960 novel Dr. Futurity. Now it was published in 1960, but it actually was written back in 1953. At the same time, he wrote another novel published in 1960 called Vulcan's Hammer. These are two novels. I'm just going to talk about Dr. Futurity in this video, and I'll come back in a little bit and talk about Vulcan's Hammer. Now, Dr. Futurity is one of those novels that Dick wrote that is kind of neglected, not really taken seriously. The plotting is kind of very contrived. It doesn't have a lot of the themes that Dick is known for, like the what is real, the what is human, the cosmic religious aspects of a lot of his writing isn't here either. It's very much contained time travel plot, as the title suggests. Nevertheless, I think Dr. Futurity has a lot of important things to say to us, and I think it's kind of politically relevant, even though it may not be really, it doesn't really seem to fit with a lot of what Dick was writing. And another thing that I think we need to remember when we read this novel is, although it was published in 1960 and it comes right before his Hugo Award-winning novel, The Man in the High Castle, and then in the 60s, from 1962 on, he writes about more than a novel a year, and they're some of his best. Now Wait for Last Year, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, culminating in 1970 with The Maze of Death, and then you kind of can start to see the end of his career at that point. So the 1960s are so great that when you see that he started the 1960s with these two novels, Dr. Futurity and Vulcan's Hammer, both of which are really flawed, both of which are very small compared to some of his later writings, they can be a bit disappointing. Another thing to say about Dick's career in the early 1960s is he was trying to get out of science fiction, actually. He was writing a lot of the mainstream novels that wouldn't be published till after he died. And those were written in this period between like 1958 and 1962, before he kind of jumped back into science fiction. And he came back and he wrote those great novels. But he was really trying to get out of science fiction at the time, which he found wasn't really advancing his ideas as well. And he wrote these novels really about middle-class life in suburbia. And in fact, I haven't read a lot of those novels. I'll try to get to them later on in this series of videos or in my podcast. But I really don't know that much about them except for one, Confessions of a Crap Artist. So in this way, Dr. Futurity was just something he published to, maybe it was for money, or maybe his agent finally got a publisher for it. But it doesn't really fit in with what he's most known for and for where his career was at the time. So it's a bit of an odd tale. Now, what to say about this novel? Well, it's about a character named Jim Parsons. And Jim Parsons is a doctor in the turn of the 21st century. So he's kind of living in our time. It was written in 1953, though. So it was set in the future. But, it's the turn of the 20th century is kind of the base timeline for the story. And then after a car accident, he wakes up and he's 500 years in the future. And what happens is he has to find out why he was sent forward in time, for what purpose, and to learn about the society he's in. So it's a bit of a utopian experiment, although it's clearly a dystopia. But it's basically a way for Dick to explore a future world. And this is something Dick was doing a lot in the mid 1950s in some of his early novels, such as Solar Lottery, The Man Who Japed. What's the other one I'm thinking of? The World Jones Made. These are novels playing with political dystopias, and I think in some ways he's building off the classic dystopias that he would have known about, like Brave New World. Especially in this novel, he's building off Brave New World in specific ways, or 1984. He's trying to explore different types of political dystopias, and this novel kind of fits alongside that. Now, why is this novel relevant for us? Is that it's really about the nature of this dystopia and the relationship between the system and the youth, and the way I guess the logic of social Darwinism is really at work in here. And that's really where it becomes a powerful novel. I'll get to that in a little bit. But as for the plot, he gets sent forward in time. He learns about the world he lives in. He comes to terms with it very quickly, and that's one of the weak points of the novel, is he basically learns our language very quickly. But he thinks he'll be fine in this future world because you always need a doctor. He learns very quickly that this world does not need doctors because it doesn't value life. It's sort of glorifies death. And some characters call the world that they're living in 500 years in the future, basically a death cult. Most people, though, accept it, that there's really no reason to live beyond your youth, because once you reach past a certain age, you don't have any reproductive capacity anymore. And for most people, they're not going to reproduce anyways, for reasons we'll get to in a moment. He finds out later on, he tries to save a girl's life, and for this he's punished. And he's punished with exile to Mars or Ganymede or one of the colonies out on other planets, where this is where, at this point in his career, Dick often threw the rejects. He did this in The Man Who Japed as well. So he goes to he's on his way to be punished, and he is sent, basically he's kidnapped by the insurgents, these rebels who had originally sent him forward in time. And they believe they're descended from the Iroquois Indians, and their main goal in their movement is to stop this culture of death. And the way they want to do this is going back in time and preventing the European invasion of North America. And the original plan was to stop Sir Francis Drake from his original exploration of California. I don't know why Dick focused on that particular event, but that's what he focused on. It seems kind of implausible that one event, killing of one explorer or conquistador, could have stopped European exploration. In fact, there are many who did die, like Captain Cook died in Hawaii and Magellan died in the Philippines. Neither of those events stopped the expansion of their nations into the Pacific, for instance. If you had killed Cortez, there would have been other conquistadors, I'm sure. But anyways, that's the plot we get. They want to go back in time and stop these European conquerors. One of them tries to do this. His name is Corinth, and he gets shot with an arrow, and he's brought back to his own time and preserved. And this rebel movement, they're called the Wolf Lodge. They try to keep him alive, basically in some kind of suspension. And they actually bring Jim Parsons just to save his life, because there's no doctors. And he is able to do this, but through the time travel mechanism, he appears dead moments later with an arrow through his heart. So they despair about doing this. Jim Parsons eventually goes back in time to see what happens at this original event, and he finds that Sir Francis Drake is not the real historical Sir Francis Drake, but a time traveler. He finds out that he's actually the one who kills Corinth in the first place. And then there's some back and forth shenanigans. He has sex with one of the women of the Wolf Lodge and actually impregnates her. He eventually goes forward in time and sees his children, learns that the Wolf Lodge has abandoned efforts to try to stop European colonialism through assassinating conquistadors, and instead tries to challenge the death cult by basically embracing life again, and by going back to natural reproduction and restoring the craft of the physician. So it's not just about bringing back a physician from the past, because the problem with that is Jim Parsons is at the end of the road of European civilization. So even though he has the knowledge, he's still of the culture that's going to create the world that they live in. So instead they have to rebuild the craft of medicine on their own. And they start to do that. And this creates a more solid foundation for challenging the order than trying to go back and manipulate time travel. Jim Parsons, after meeting his children as adults, because he goes forward in time a little bit, he sees that things are on a solid footing. He decides to go back to his own time and see his wife and children. And that's essentially the novel we have. The most important thing about Dr. Futurity, though, is the world that's described in the future. It's got a couple characteristics. One is it's entirely racially amalgamated. So although there's a lot of racial tension and conflict in the novel, particularly dealing with the civilization that Europeans created through conquest and genocide in the New World, the world of the future is racially mixed. It's also linguistically and ethnically mixed. So there's no racial or ethnic divisions anymore. Everyone is the same color, essentially, through intermarriages over time. This is actually something that was occasionally talked about in some 20th century writing. I was just doing a series on Charles W. Chestnut, and he wrote an essay basically on the future of American race, and he predicted racial amalgamation in a couple hundred years. So, these ideas may have been out there a little bit more commonly. But that's what Dick kind of predicts for the future in this novel. Now, there's still a lot of conflict in society, though, because if people aren't divided by race, they're divided into tribes that they're put into rather randomly. Basically, when they're born, they're put into tribes, and these tribes will compete, and they often compete to the point of violence and fighting and killing each other. But the winner of these competitions benefit because their gametes are stored in what's called the soul cube, which is the central reproductive agent. So in this world, sex and reproduction are completely detached. All men are sterilized, and there's no real marriage. There's some kind of coupling going on, but there's no marriage. In fact, one of the men who talks to Jim Parsons when he first comes offers him his, not really his wife, but his partner to sleep with for the night. And when they find out he wasn't sterilized, they don't allow that. But nevertheless, there's really not any hang up over monogamy because paternity doesn't matter anymore. Now, the theory behind this is that if the winners of these competitions have their gametes selected, then the next generation of children will always be the same, will always be better, right? Will always improve. And that's one reason you get this kind of racial amalgamation as well, is because you're taking gametes from the winners of these tribes. They're not pairing up based on attraction or physical features or race. These aren't barriers. Now, in fact, when Dick was writing this, many states in the United States still had bans on interracial marriage. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that Virginia, for instance, or the Supreme Court finally struck down state laws that could prohibit interracial marriage. And I forget when the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner came out, but that was also like the mid-60s, maybe 67, 68. So the theory is a kind of social Darwinism, that society will always improve and people become more intelligent and more competitive and stronger over time. But the result is actually a quite stagnated society. And this is what the rebels, the Wolf Legion, the Wolf Lodge seems to understand, is that society has stagnated into this kind of tribal conflicts and it doesn't really have progress or future anymore. So I think Dick has a really interesting commentary here on social Darwinism, this focus on competitiveness, this focus on death, this idea that life only matters in the sense that you can reproduce and pass on your genes actually creates a lot of stagnation. And despite having a culture that aggrandizes youth and power and strength, the youth are being consumed by this culture. The average population in this world is something like 15. People don't commonly live past 30. If you're injured, if you're slightly, even one woman is just slightly scarred in her face and she's put to death because she has no purpose anymore. For the tribe, for the community. So death is not important. In fact, the first thing that happens to Parsons when he goes into the future is he's almost hit by a car because when he's stepping out on the road, the driver assumes he wants to die. And he narrowly avoids being killed. So that's the basic social structure we're given. And then the wolf tribe struggles in resistance against this. Now their goal, of course, is to try to, they blame the whole thing on European civilization. Focus on conquest and blood and progress rather than more meaningful aspects of life. And so the goal is to stop the European conquest. They fail in doing this, and then they have to find another strategy. And that strategy becomes a reinvestment and a re-engagement with the culture of life, which comes from returning to natural childbirth and restoring the art of the physician. Now, we know from Dick's other works that he was hostile to abortion, and he wrote a short story in the 70s, right around the time that the Roe versus Wade decision was made, called The Pre-Persons, which is basically an argument that the logical extension, he argues in that story that the logical extension of abortion is to identify children as pre-persons as well. So he certainly had this anti-abortion view. Some of those ideas are actually here too, because we have a culture that's just consuming young people and leading them to short, vicious, violent lives without any creativity, without the ability to really meet their potential as human beings, because of a focus on controlling reproduction and ensuring that the next generation is stronger and more vital. And in fact, the opposite happens. What we get is a culture that's very bland and brutal and kind of meaningless. Here's how one character describes it. We've made our point, but we've achieved a calcified society that spends its time meditating about death. It has no plans, no direction, no desire for growth. Our nagging sense of inferiority has betrayed us. It's made us expand our energies in recovering our pride, improving our ancient enemies false. Like the Egyptian society, death and life so interwoven that the world has become a cemetery, and the people no more than custodians living among the bones of the dead. They are virtually the pre-dead in their own minds, so their great heritage has been frittered away. Think what we might have become. End quote. So I think that kind of sums up the thematic core of the novel, which is a celebration of life. So, I mean, I guess there's what to say about Dr. Futurity. It is what it is. It's a very flawed novel. The time travel story is kind of preposterous. this whole plot of trying to kill Sir Francis Drake to stop the European conquest of America is so contrived and ridiculous, and it just comes off as rather silly. Yet I think there are themes here that you might find valuable, especially when we think about, the world, the world we're leaving to young people. I don't want to go so far as to say that we're in a death cult, but we certainly are not giving this opportunities to young people that older generations had. We see millennials stuck in debt, stuck in often meaningless jobs in this Uber economy. And perhaps this is part of the system that we've established, older people have established. So it's a really kind of interesting irony in that we have a world here completely dominated by inventions and ideas from the past, from hundreds of years in the past maybe, yet the world aggrandizes and celebrates youth in aggressive ways. Now, this book can also pair, I think, nicely. Obviously, it doesn't compare in terms of literary quality, but there's themes here that I think compare to maybe Brave New World, and Dick certainly was feeding off of Brave New World, especially in the idea of a controlling of reproduction and raising people to accept that world that they're in rather than challenging it. And then the resistance coming from kind of tribal entities. In this case, it's people who believe they're descended from the Iroquois, and of course, in Brave New World, it was, some oddball people who didn't fit in. That's something that Dick kind of plays with here, sending them off to the frontier. But then, of course, John Savage in that novel. And here it's the wolf tribe of people who associate themselves with Native Americans. He doesn't show a lot of knowledge about the Native American history or diversity or cultures, but he makes a bit of an attempt to put them into the story. And I think another way this story can be interesting to people today is that he does try to address this question of the legacy of Atlantic history, the legacy of the European conquest of the Americas, and the legacy of genocide. And by presenting European conquest as a negative thing, it's, there's this really important question that Parsons, of course, has to face. He himself is a product of European civilization. He benefits from it. His skill as a doctor comes out of that culture, but he realizes when he sees far in the future, the long-term consequences of that culture are negative and are totally opposed to his values as a doctor. And so he comes to the conclusion that maybe European culture needed to have been stopped, even if that meant my own existence or my own world, the one that I understand, will be destroyed. And I think Dick is also very interesting in presenting a post-racial world that's still bearing the weight of the ideology and the values and the systems created by white supremacists hundreds of years earlier. So in that sense, I think there's some fascinating things here. It's put together rather poorly, and I understand people who criticize this novel, and along with Vulcan's Hammer, which I'll look at next. I understand the criticisms of these novels, but I think it has some lessons for us, and that's kind of what I want to say. So this isn't a full defense of Dr. Futurity by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a plea to maybe look at it with fresh eyes and try to look at it thematically and see if there's anything there that speaks to our own time. So that does it. That's my review of Dr. Futurity. Because you can see I don't even have my own standalone copy of it. It's part of this 3 early novels version. But anyways, that's it. Take it or leave it. I'll be back with other videos on Philip Dick and some other themes, other series I'm developing on this channel. So please subscribe, and I'll put up other content shortly. So there it is. Leave your own comments below what you thought of Dr. Futurity. If you stand by your view, as many people do, that this is one of his worst novels, please leave your feelings about that below as well. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you shortly with other reviews of Philip Dick and some other content.